There was an unwelcome fourth man hanging around the Fantasy Suites episode of The Bachelorette on Monday. That would be Becca Kufrin's former fiancé Arie Luyendyk Jr., who was invoked by her on all three of her dates, unfairly in one of those instances, and unconsciously, one hopes, parroted by finalist Arie Luyendyk Jr. when he said he would choose Becca every day, which is pretty much exactly what Arie said when he proposed to Becca as The Bachelor. Becca Kufrin on an earlier episode with Arie Luyendyk Jr., one of the three men up for a night in Fantasy Suite, on the July 23 episode of The Bachelorette, Paul Hebert, ABC, yes, Garrett, alas, made the final two along with Blake Horstmann. I should have seen Jason Tartick's exit coming, but I let myself be bamboozled by the skillful editing on the Hometowns episode as well as my lack of enthusiasm for Garrett. Clearly, wishing for something not to happen isn't the same as it not happening. Anyway, Becca sent Jason home without so much as a peek at the Fantasy Suite. She cried copious tears over it and said she literally just did to him what Arie did to me. No, Becca, no, you did not. Arie told you he loved you, proposed to you, and then blindsided you with a breakup on what you thought was a weekend getaway with your fiancé. He prolonged your pain for the sake of making dramatic TV and lied that he wanted to explore things with Lauren Burnham when he already knew damn well she was taking him back. Article continued below. That does not compare to sending Jason home early because you knew you had stronger feelings for Blake and Garrett, not by a long shot, despite how hurt he was and how crappy it made you feel. Lecture over. Let's break down the episode. Date number 1 with Blake. This show has a mean sense of humor sometimes. Blake said he couldn't wait to touch and kiss Becca, and then he learned they were going for a hike on the Monk's Trail in Chiang Mai, Thailand, to a particularly sacred Buddhist temple, and they weren't allowed to touch or kiss the whole way there and back. Nonetheless, they both took meaning from the temple monk's advice to incorporate honesty, compromise, patience and giving in their life together. I think neither of us have really found those 4 things in a relationship, Blake told Becca, harkening back to her experience with Arie Luyendyk in his voiceover. But Blake wasn't feeling quite as serene as his demeanor at the temple would suggest. He was fearful of how Becca felt about Garrett and Jason, even though he was convinced neither of them loved her as much as he did, and he told her that at dinner. Becca didn't tell Blake she loved him back, even though she had already admitted that in confessional, but she did tell him he was the most solid and the most consistent, and she always felt like they were moving forward. Becca also mentioned feeling exactly the way Blake was feeling now about Arie in the last weeks of The Bachelor, which seemed much less reassuring. But then, when Blake told Becca he was the kind of man who looks for a reason to stay, not for a reason to go, it gave Becca the chills and melted her heart, a bit of a mixed metaphor. That article continued below. Of course, Blake accepted the invitation to the Fantasy Suite. The next morning, they snuggled in bed and Becca declared in her voiceover that she was even more in love with Blake. But Blake's voiceover was less cheerful. I'm more scared of never waking up next to her again, foreshadowing an attempt to throw us off the scent of the winner? Who knows? Date no. 2 with Jason. It was obvious from the early minutes of the show that Jason would be the odd man out since Becca described herself as in love with Blake and Garrett, but only falling in love with Jason. Another bad sign? When you interrupt your fun day at the market for a mini freakout because you just joked about your future as a couple with the guy and it made you feel weird, despite Becca saying she wanted to get back on track with Jason at dinner, her stilted conversation about their hometown date, and the distressed look in her eyes as Jason talked about telling his parents he loved her made it pretty obvious Jason wasn't getting a Fantasy Suite invitation. When he asked Becca how she was feeling, she began to try to explain her doubts of earlier in the day and then left the table. Once alone, she paced around and cried and questioned what was wrong with her since Jason was a great guy who was telling her everything I would want to hear, but she returned to tell Jason she couldn't put him through an overnight date if it wasn't 100% there. Jason, obviously not a quitter, tried to convince Becca to carry on and see what else is there, but she insisted, I just don't think we can get there at the end. Jason, ever the gentleman, left after telling Becca he was still rooting for her happiness. Becca was still tearful about the breakup the next morning but perked up at the thought of seeing Garrett. Date no. 3 with Garrett. Becca and Garrett just happened to go bamboo rafting on a jungle river during a Thai national holiday, so they had lots of company from other rafts, people and elephants, and lots of sets of eyes as they smooched on the riverbank. Becca was still waiting for Garrett to tell her he loved her, and she got her wish as they picnicked under the stars later. Garrett told Becca that despite his initial fears of getting engaged or married again, "Seeing the way you interacted with my family, I realized, how much I truly do love you and you make me very happy. I hope you're the last woman I ever have to say that to," he added. In voiceover, Becca said Garrett's declaration felt right and tells me that we are on the same page. Garrett said the way Becca kissed him told him that she loved him too. They repaired to the fantasy suite, a tree house with a tent. Another echo of Arie since he and Becca spent their fantasy suite date in a tent in the desert. In voiceovers, Garrett said Becca was making him become a better man. "Let's hope he really means that, especially if they end up engaged," and Becca said she saw Garrett as her heart's equal, a great future husband and father. There was much snuggling and goodbye smooching when they woke up the next morning, with Becca saying they had taken leaps in their relationship. The return of Jason. Jason was back, saying that he still loved Becca and wasn't ready to let her go. But his visit to her hotel suite turned out to be less about winning her over than getting closure, and it was a rather sad visit at that. Jason struggled to hold back tears as they talked, and he cried when he said in confessional, "I never expected to come into this and develop the feelings I felt, but I did." And despite the fact he'd felt blindsided by her, he left Becca with best wishes for her happiness and the gift of a keepsake album of their time together. That is why Jason will probably be the next Bachelor, despite the fact the franchise had the perfect candidate for its first black Bachelor in Wills. "I really hope he finds somebody, and I know that he will, and she's gonna have to treat him like a king," Becca said. "He deserves only the best." The rose ceremony. This was a honor with Jason gone. The only question was who'd get their rose first, and it was Garrett. This was also the point at which Garrett made his comment about choosing Becca every moment of the day, every day, in voiceover. He also made a toast to Becca and "the love you make my heart feel" in front of Blake, which seemed at the very least tacky and at the most malicious. It's off to the Maldives for the rivals to meet Becca's family and for an emotional end to the season, but first we have the Men Tell All episode with special emphasis on Chris R. Fletch, Jason and Jordan. Keep an eye on Jason and see if he gets the future Bachelor makeover and edit. You can watch Monday at 8 p.m. on City. And you can email me at dyeo@thestar.ca, tweet me at realityo, or visit my Facebook page.